My name is Lena, and for most of my adult life, people would describe me as steady, dependable, quiet in a way that felt comforting to them. I'm in my mid-30s now, and back when this story began, I was working full-time, managing a household rhythm that wasn't entirely my own, and playing a role I never formally agreed to, but somehow inherited. I've always been the kind of person others underestimate without meaning to. Not because they think I'm incapable, but because I don't announce my capabilities. I don't raise my voice. I don't fight for attention. I listen. I notice. I absorb. And in families like mine, that combination often gets translated into something else entirely. She's fine. She can handle it. She doesn't need help. This story isn't about villains or heroes. It's about a slow emotional erosion that happens when your needs are consistently minimized, especially by the one person you expect to hear you. In my case, that person was my sister, the one everyone assumed would always have my back, the one I went to quietly more than once when I was drowning in ways that didn't look dramatic from the outside. She ignored my pleas for help, not with cruelty, not with intention, but with absence, with postponement, with that familiar phrase, "we'll talk later." Later, that never came. What you're about to hear is not a story of revenge. There's no shouting match, no public humiliation, no moment where I stand up and list every wrong done to me. This is an account of how power can shift without noise, how silence, when chosen consciously, becomes something entirely different from silence imposed on you. You'll hear about invisibility and how easy it is for others to grow comfortable with it. You'll hear about the moment something changed inside me, not because someone finally apologized, but because I stopped waiting. And you'll hear how help eventually came, but only on my terms. I'm not telling this to dramatize pain or to make anyone look monstrous. I'm telling it because emotional justice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives through clarity, through restraint, through the quiet decision to stop explaining yourself to people who have already decided not to listen. If you've ever been the reliable one, the reasonable one, the person whose struggles were overlooked because you seemed strong, you might recognize parts of yourself in this journey. So before we begin in earnest, let me ask you something gently, without pressure. Have you ever realized that the moment you stopped asking for help was the moment you started taking your power back? To understand how everything unfolded, you need to understand who I was to them long before I understood who I was to myself. In my family, I was the steady one. Not the oldest. That was my sister, Claire. Not the youngest either. I existed somewhere in the middle, where expectations were quiet but constant. I was the one people relied on without asking first. If something needed to be done, it somehow made its way to me. If someone was overwhelmed, I was the one expected to stay calm so the room could breathe again. No one ever said this out loud. That's how these roles survive, by staying unnamed. At family gatherings, Claire was the voice people listened to. She was decisive, expressive, and emotionally visible. When she spoke, people paused. When I spoke, people nodded politely and continued with whatever they were already doing, not out of disrespect, just habit. I didn't demand space, so none was cleared for me. I was easy, low maintenance, independent. Those labels followed me everywhere, and for a long time I wore them like proof that I was doing adulthood correctly. If I was tired, I hid it. If I was confused, I researched quietly. If I was hurting, I waited until the feeling passed or learned how to carry it better. From the outside, my life looked functional. Stable job, clean apartment, no dramatic implosions. I paid my bills on time. I remembered birthdays. I showed up when I said I would. People trust consistency, even when they don't fully see the person behind it. Claire used to tell people, "Lena's strong. She's always been fine on her own." And I never corrected her. At work, it was the same pattern. I was the one managers leaned on during transitions, reorganizations, and quiet crises that needed smoothing rather than spotlighting. I didn't get described as ambitious or bold. I got described as reliable, which sounds like a compliment until you realize how often it's used to justify overlooking someone. But the most defining version of me, the one that mattered later, was the version my sister believed in most firmly. To her, I was the backup plan. If she needed flexibility, I'd adjust. If she needed support, I'd provide it. If she was overwhelmed, my emotions became optional. I don't think she ever consciously decided this. It emerged slowly, like furniture placed in a room over time, until no one remembers what the space looked like empty. When she spoke about her stress, everyone listened. When I hinted at mine, it was reframed. You always land on your feet. You're good at handling things. You'll figure it out. Those sentences were meant as reassurance. They landed like quiet erasures. I learned early that my distress didn't register unless it became inconvenient, and I wasn't willing to become inconvenient, so I became efficient instead. I solved problems before they escalated. I absorbed disappointment before it spilled outward. I learned how to speak in neutral tones even when something inside me was unraveling. I told myself that this was maturity, emotional regulation, strength. What I didn't realize was that invisibility, when practiced long enough, starts to feel like identity. People didn't ignore me because they disliked me. They ignored me because I had trained them to believe I didn't require much. And Claire, busy, capable, admired Claire, never questioned that assumption. When I needed help, truly needed it, I didn't know how to ask loudly. I asked the only way I knew how. Carefully, softly, with context, with disclaimers, with an apology built in. And from her perspective, those requests didn't sound urgent. They sounded optional, like something that could wait until later. So later is what I got. This is not the part of the story where anything dramatic happens. No argument, no betrayal, just a quiet foundation being laid. One where my role was already defined long before I understood the cost of it. I was the one who could handle it, the one who didn't need much, the one who would still be there tomorrow. And everyone, including my sister, built their expectations accordingly. The first time I asked my sister for help, it didn't feel like a turning point. It felt small, reasonable, almost forgettable. That's why it stayed with me. I remember sitting in my car outside my apartment building, engine off, hands still on the steering wheel. I had just come back from a doctor's appointment I hadn't told anyone about, not because it was dramatic, but because it was one more thing I assumed I should manage quietly. The diagnosis wasn't catastrophic, but it explained months of exhaustion, brain fog, and that constant feeling that I was running a marathon on half a tank. The doctor had been gentle, practical. He talked about adjustments, rest, and support systems. Support systems. That phrase echoed in my head longer than it should have. I didn't call Claire right away. I went upstairs, made tea I didn't drink, and stared at the same wall for longer than necessary. Then I sat on the edge of my couch and rehearsed what I would say, not the facts, but the tone. Calm, grounded, non-alarming. When I finally called her, I didn't say, "I'm struggling." I said, "I could use a little help with something if you have time." She answered distractedly. Background noise, movement. Her life is progressing. "What's up?" she asked. I explained. Briefly. Carefully. I told her about the diagnosis, about how I might need some support for a few months. Rides to appointments, help sorting through paperwork, maybe just someone to check in with me so I didn't default into pretending I was fine. There was a pause on the line. Not a long one. Just long enough for me to notice. "Okay," she said. "Yeah, that sounds like a lot." I waited. "I've just got a lot on my plate right now," she continued. "Can we talk about this later? Maybe next week?" Next week felt reasonable. I said yes. I thanked her for listening. I hung up before my voice could do anything unpredictable. Nothing about that exchange was unkind. That's what made it dangerous. The week passed, then another, then a third. She didn't bring it up again. I didn't remind her. I told myself she was busy. I told myself I hadn't been clear enough. I told myself that if it were serious, I would have pushed harder. But the thing about small cuts is that they don't hurt much at first. You barely register them. You just notice that something feels off. The next time was even smaller. I was overwhelmed at work. New management, shifting expectations, longer hours without acknowledgement. I mentioned it to Claire in passing during a family dinner. I didn't ask for help. I just named the feeling. She smiled sympathetically. You always end up being the capable one, she said. That's why they lean on you. It was meant as praise, but something in me recoiled. I realized, sitting there with my fork halfway to my mouth, that I had just been gently dismissed again, not because she didn't care, but because the version of me she held in her mind didn't include need. Later that night, I wrote it down in my notebook, not dramatically, just a sentence. Asked for help, deferred, no follow-up. I didn't know why I wrote it. I wasn't building a case. I wasn't angry. I think I just needed proof that it had happened, that I hadn't imagined the emptiness that followed. From Claire's perspective, nothing had changed. She still loved me, still assumed I was fine, still believed that if I truly needed her, I would say so. But from mine, something had shifted slightly out of alignment. I had asked, I had heard, and then I had been silenced. No one noticed, not her, not the family, not even me at first. But that was the first small cut, and unlike the others I'd learned to ignore, this one didn't close on its own. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic followed. That's how it works. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It settles in quietly, then waits to see if you'll challenge it. I didn't. I adapted. When Claire didn't circle back about my health, I told myself it was my responsibility to manage it anyway. When she forgot follow-ups, I reframed them as misunderstandings. When weeks turned into months, I convinced myself that asking again would feel like pressure, and I didn't want to be that person. So I normalized the absence. I adjusted my expectations without ever saying them out loud. I stopped assuming she'd check in. I stopped bringing things up unless they were already resolved. I began editing my own experiences before sharing them, filtering out anything that might require sustained attention. This wasn't conscious self-sacrifice. It felt practical, mature. At family gatherings, Claire would talk about her stress in detail. Work deadlines, relationship strain, the weight of being needed by everyone. I listened. I empathized. I offered solutions when asked. When it was my turn to speak, I summarized. I'm okay, I'd say. Busy, but managing. Nothing I can't handle. And everyone nodded, relieved. The thing I didn't realize then was that I was teaching people how to treat me by showing them what I was willing to tolerate. The dynamic solidified slowly. If Claire needed something last minute, she assumed I'd rearrange my schedule. If I needed something, it was discussed hypothetically, then postponed indefinitely. If she was overwhelmed, it was an emergency. If I was overwhelmed, it was a phase. There was always a justification. She had more responsibility. She was under more pressure. She expressed her emotions more openly, and I was good at being fine. So I became the contrast that made her stress look louder, heavier, more legitimate. Sometimes I wondered what would happen if I didn't respond immediately, if I didn't smooth things over, if I let a request sit unanswered the way mine did. But the thought made me uncomfortable. That wasn't who I was. I didn't want to keep score. I didn't want to be petty. I believed that relationships weren't transactional. What I didn't understand yet was that boundaries aren't transactions either. They're definitions. Without them, patterns harden. The clearest moment came on a Tuesday afternoon, and I still remember it for no particular reason. I was sitting at my desk at work, staring at an email I didn't have the energy to answer. My phone buzzed. It was Claire. Can you watch the kids this weekend? Just for a few hours. I really need a break. I stared at the message longer than necessary. That weekend, I had a medical appointment I was anxious about. One I had mentioned months earlier. One she had postponed discussing. I typed, deleted, and retyped my response. I have an appointment I can't miss, I wrote, but I could help another time. The reply came quickly. Oh, okay, I'll figure something out. No follow-up, no question about the appointment, no acknowledgement that this was the same thing I'd once asked for support for. That's when something inside me went quiet. Not angry, not hurt in a dramatic way, just clear. I realized I had been operating under an unspoken rule. My needs were flexible. Hers were fixed. And I had helped write that rule by being endlessly accommodating. I started noticing how often this happened, not just with Claire, but everywhere. At work, in friendships. I was the one people leaned on, but rarely leaned back toward. And because I didn't protest, because I didn't escalate, because I didn't demand space, the imbalance felt normal to everyone else, including me. That's how disrespect becomes invisible, not through cruelty, but through consistency. Through patterns that feel reasonable in isolation and undeniable only in hindsight. I wasn't being mistreated in obvious ways. I was being slowly deprioritized. And the most uncomfortable realization of all was this. I was participating in it. By staying quiet, by minimizing my own needs, by calling endurance strength. This wasn't the moment I decided to change anything. That came later. But it was the moment I stopped being surprised. Once you recognize the role you've been assigned, you start seeing it everywhere. Mine was clear by then, even if no one had ever named it. I was the reliable one. The buffer. The person who absorbed pressure so others could stay comfortable. I existed to make things easier, not to need things myself. And the unsettling part was this. The role didn't come from malice, it came from repetition. Over time, people stopped asking if I could help and started assuming I would. My availability was treated as a constant, not a choice. When I did say no, rarely, carefully, it created confusion, not respect. At family events, Claire would assign tasks without looking at me. Lena will handle that, she'd say casually, already moving on to the next thing. And I would because correcting her felt like causing friction where none existed. But something subtle had changed. I was no longer invisible, I was useful. That distinction matters. Being invisible means you're overlooked. Being useful means you're seen, but only for what you provide. My presence was acknowledged in relation to function, not experience. If I was tired, it didn't register. If I were stressed, it didn't interrupt plans. If I needed support, it was abstract. Because the role I played didn't include collapse. I noticed how often people spoke about me rather than to me. Lena's good with details. Lena doesn't mind helping. Lena's low drama. Low drama. As if emotional restraint were a personality rather than a strategy. At work, I was given responsibilities without authority, projects without recognition. When things ran smoothly, it was expected. When they didn't, it was quietly redirected to me to fix. No one was exploiting me intentionally. They were responding to the version of me I consistently presented. And Claire, my sister, mirrored this perfectly. She came to me when she needed to be calm. When she needed logistics. When she needed someone to listen without making it about themselves. But when I needed emotional presence, real presence, it was deferred. I just don't have the capacity right now, she'd say. I started noticing how often capacity was framed as a one-way street. Her overwhelm was a reason. Mine was a footnote. And still, I didn't confront her. Not because I was afraid, but because confrontation felt misaligned with who I was becoming. I wasn't interested in convincing her to care. I was interested in understanding the structure we were both standing in. So I observed. I paid attention to patterns, to timing, to what happened when I stepped back just slightly. If I took longer to respond, someone else filled the gap. If I didn't volunteer, the task still got done. Just not by me. The world didn't collapse. That realization was quietly destabilizing. It meant my role wasn't essential. It was convenient. And convenience, once withdrawn, is often mistaken for betrayal. I realized that as long as I continued to play the role without question, nothing would change. Not because people are cruel, but because systems persist until disrupted. And I wasn't ready to disrupt anything yet, but I was ready to stop performing automatically. I began doing something small but significant. I paused. Before saying yes. Before smoothing things over. Before explaining myself. I didn't announce this shift. I didn't dramatize it. I simply allowed space where there had always been immediacy. Claire noticed, but misinterpreted it. "You've been quiet lately," she said once. "Everything okay?" I smiled. "Yeah, just busy." And for the first time, that answer wasn't an invitation for reassurance, it was a boundary disguised as normalcy. The role I had been assigned was clear now, and I finally understood something crucial. Roles only exist as long as you continue to play them. The day something shifted wasn't loud. There was no argument, no confrontation, no breaking point that others could point to later and say, "That's when it all changed." It happened on an ordinary morning in an ordinary kitchen while I was doing something I'd done 1,000 times before. I was making coffee before work, standing barefoot on the cold tile, watching the kettle heat. My phone was on the counter, screen lighting up with notifications I didn't feel urgency toward anymore. There was a message from Claire. "Can you call me today? I really need to talk." I stared at it for a moment longer than usual. Normally, I would have responded immediately. Of course, anytime. What's wrong? Instead, I set the phone face down. It wasn't intentional rebellion, it was instinct. Something in me didn't reach forward the way it always had. As I poured the water, I noticed how tired I felt, not physically, but internally. The kind of tired that comes from constant emotional availability without reciprocity. The kind that doesn't resolve with rest. I went to work. I focused. I handled my responsibilities with the same quiet efficiency I always had, but beneath it, something had recalibrated. At lunch, I reread Claire's message. She needed to talk. That sentence used to activate something in me, a readiness, a concern, a reflexive sense of responsibility. This time, it registered differently. She needs, not I'm available. And in that space between those two truths, something settled. I texted back, "I'm tied up today. Can we talk later this week?" The words felt neutral, reasonable, familiar. They were the same kind of response she'd given me months earlier. She replied an hour later, "Oh, okay, let me know when you're free." No anger, no urgency, just acceptance. And that's when it happened. I realized that I had spent years treating her capacity as fixed and mine as elastic, stretching myself to accommodate her, assuming she couldn't do the same. But here she was, adjusting without protest. The imbalance wasn't inevitable. It was habitual. That afternoon, I sat in my car after work, the same place I'd once called her for help. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt steady. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. That night, I opened my notebook, the one I'd been carrying for years without quite knowing why. I didn't write about Claire. I didn't list grievances. I wrote one sentence. I don't need to explain my needs to people who consistently minimize them. Reading it back, I felt a strange sense of relief. Not empowerment in a cinematic sense. Clarity. I thought about all the moments I'd waited for someone to notice I was struggling. All the times I'd softened my voice so I wouldn't sound demanding. All the ways I'd made myself easy to ignore. And I understood something quietly but completely. No one was coming to recalibrate this for me. If I wanted things to change, it wouldn't come from a speech or a confrontation. It would come from consistency. From withdrawing my automatic availability, from letting people experience the absence of what I'd always provided. Not as punishment, as truth. Claire called me 2 days later. I let it go to voicemail. Not out of spite, out of alignment. I called her back the next evening, calm and unhurried. She talked about her stress, her exhaustion, her need for support. I listened, fully, without interruption. And when she finished, there was a pause. "Do you have time to help me with something this weekend?" she asked. I took a breath. "I don't," I said. "I need that time for myself." The silence on the line wasn't hostile. It was unfamiliar. "Oh," she said. "Okay." That was it. No argument, no guilt, no justification required. After we hung up, I didn't feel powerful. I felt aligned. Something had shifted, not in her, but in me. Silence was no longer something imposed on me. It was something I could choose. Once silence becomes a choice, it stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like structure. I didn't announce a change. I didn't explain myself. I simply stopped filling every gap the moment it appeared. Where I once rushed to respond, I allowed time. Where I once volunteered, I waited to be asked. Where I once over-explained, I answered plainly. From the outside, it probably looked like withdrawal. From the inside, it felt like regulation. Claire noticed, of course, but not in the way I expected. "You've been really quiet lately," she said one afternoon when we met for coffee. Did I do something? I considered that question carefully, not because I was searching for the right answer, but because I was deciding how much access she still had to my internal world. "No," I said, "I've just been focusing on my own things." She nodded, but her expression tightened slightly. People are comfortable with your silence until it changes its function. Before, my quietness had been convenient. It made space for others. Now it created uncertainty. At first, she filled that uncertainty with assumptions. "You're probably just busy. You always handle things on your own. You don't really need much, do you?" I didn't correct her. I had learned that correcting perceptions often invites debate. Letting them stand reveals their consequences. As I became less available, small disruptions appeared. Claire had to rearrange plans, ask other people, sit with her own stress longer than usual. None of this was dramatic, but it was new. And she didn't like it. She started reaching out more frequently, not with curiosity, but with urgency. "Can you talk now? I really need your input. I don't know what to do." Each message tested the boundary without naming it. And each time I responded based on capacity, not obligation. Sometimes I said yes. Often I didn't. What surprised me most was how quickly silence was reinterpreted. When I was always available, my presence was taken for granted. When I became selective, my absence was noticed. Silence, I learned, is never neutral. It either protects you or erases you, depending on who controls it. At work, the same pattern emerged. When I stopped automatically stepping in, managers hesitated. Meetings stretched longer. Decisions took more effort, and slowly my role shifted from background support to visible contributor. Not because I demanded recognition, but because my absence made my value legible. With Claire, the adjustment was slower. She began framing my boundaries as emotional distance. "You seem different," she said once, "like you're pulling away." I didn't deny it. "I'm just being more intentional," I replied. That word unsettled her. Intentional meant my actions weren't reflexive. They were considered, chosen. And chosen silence can feel threatening to people who benefit from your automatic presence. There were moments when I felt the old pull to explain, to reassure, to soften the shift so it wouldn't discomfort her. But I resisted that urge. Not out of coldness, out of respect for myself. I had spent years explaining my needs gently, carefully, in ways that made them easy to ignore. I wasn't interested in repeating that cycle. Instead, I let my actions speak. I declined invitations without apology. I stopped anticipating needs that weren't expressed. I ended conversations when they became emotionally one-sided. And slowly, something else happened. I began hearing myself again. Without constant noise from others, my internal voice grew clearer. I noticed patterns in my own behavior. How quickly I moved toward responsibility, how rarely I paused to ask whether something was actually mine to carry. Silence gave me space to observe not just others, but myself. Claire eventually asked, "Are you upset with me?" The question was familiar. It used to trap me into reassurance. This time I answered honestly. "No," I said. "I'm just not available in the same way anymore." She didn't know what to do with that. Availability had always been the foundation of our dynamic. Without it, she had to reassess. Not just me, but herself. And that reassessment wasn't comfortable. But it was necessary, because silence, when chosen deliberately, isn't withdrawal. It's recalibration. While everyone was adjusting to my quiet, something else was happening beneath the surface. Preparation, not in a dramatic, scheming sense, but in the way people prepare when they finally stop waiting for permission to take their own lives seriously. What Claire and most people never noticed was how much I had always been paying attention. My silence had never been empty. It had been observational. I noticed patterns, I remembered timelines, I tracked inconsistencies. This wasn't paranoia, it was orientation. When you spend years being minimized, you learn to gather context before you speak, because when you do, it has to be precise. As I became less emotionally available, I became more internally focused. I started documenting things, not grievances, but facts, dates, conversations, promises made and quietly dropped. Not to weaponize them, but to understand the structure I was operating inside. At work, I began reviewing my responsibilities more critically. I listed everything I handled that wasn't in my job description, everything I fixed quietly so others wouldn't have to. The list was longer than I expected. I didn't confront my manager. I didn't complain. I updated my resume, methodically, without urgency. I took note of my measurable impact, the kind that doesn't require interpretation. Reduced delays, streamlined processes, resolved issues before escalation. I realized that I had been performing at a level that exceeded my title without ever making that visible. So I made it visible, quietly. I began sending follow-up emails, documenting decisions, asking for confirmation in writing. Not defensively, professionally. The effect was immediate. Suddenly, my work was being referenced. My name is attached to outcomes. Not because I asked for credit, but because the paper trail demanded acknowledgement. With Claire, the preparation looked different. I stopped offering emotional labor without reciprocity. I noticed how often she vented without asking how I was, how quickly conversations returned to her needs. I didn't interrupt, I observed, and I began setting limits that were small but firm. I can talk for 10 minutes. I don't have the energy for this right now. I need to step away. Each boundary was a data point. Some were respected, some were tested. The tests were telling. She would push just slightly, reframe urgency, emphasize stress, imply disappointment. Not maliciously, habitually. And each time I held the line. What she never noticed was that I was learning something crucial. Who adjusts when I set boundaries, and who resists? That distinction mattered more than any apology ever could. Outside of family and work, I started strengthening other parts of my life. I reconnected with people who didn't drain me. I invested time in therapy, not to vent, but to clarify, to name patterns without minimizing them, to distinguish compassion from self-erasure. I learned language for things I had always felt but never articulated. I wasn't too independent. I was overfunctioning in systems that rewarded my silence. I wasn't low maintenance. I was under-supported. Those realizations didn't make me angry. They made me precise. Precision changes everything. Claire continued to live under the assumption that things were essentially the same, that I was just going through a phase. She didn't realize that the phases end. Decisions don't. She didn't notice that I had stopped sharing vulnerabilities, that I no longer sought validation from her, that my emotional center had shifted inward. And she certainly didn't notice that I was positioning myself differently in every area of my life, not for revenge, but for independence. I wasn't preparing to confront her. I was preparing to no longer need her response. That's the kind of preparation no one sees coming, because it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't rush. It simply removes leverage. And the moment you remove leverage from someone who's been unconsciously using it, the entire dynamic begins to destabilize. Quietly. The private reveal didn't come as a shock. It came as confirmation. By the time it happened, I wasn't searching for answers anymore. I was verifying what I already suspected about my position in the family, about the way support flowed in only one direction, and about how much of my stability had been quietly propping up other people's lives. The realization arrived on a Sunday afternoon, unremarkable in every external way. I was sitting at my dining table with my notebook open, papers spread around it. Not emotional papers, practical ones. Financial statements, calendars I'd archived instead of deleting, things I'd never thought to place side by side before. When I did, a pattern emerged that was impossible to unsee. For years, I had been contributing more than anyone realized. Not just emotionally, but tangibly. I had been absorbing costs, covering gaps, offering time, logistics, and flexibility that had real value. Value that had never been acknowledged because it had never been itemized. I wasn't being taken advantage of in a dramatic way. I was being quietly relied upon. And that reliance had created an imbalance of power that no one had ever named, least of all me. The most striking part wasn't how much I'd given. It was how little had been built to support me in return. Claire had always assumed I was fine because I made it so. I compensated early, smoothed consequences, and handled fallout before it reached her. In doing so, I had shielded her from the reality of my limits. That was the reveal. Not that she didn't care, but that she didn't have to care deeply because the system didn't require it. I saw clearly then that asking her to change would never rebalance things. The structure itself had to shift. And structures don't respond to emotion. They respond to removal. That afternoon, I made several decisions without drama. I separated responsibilities that had never been formally assigned to me but had slowly become expected. I created boundaries in writing, not to send, but to define. I recalculated what I was willing to give without resentment and what I wasn't. I also recognized something else, something quieter and more uncomfortable. If Claire had suddenly shown up perfectly, apologetic, attentive, transformed, it still wouldn't have fixed what had been eroded, because the damage wasn't just relational. It was internal. I had learned to disappear in order to be loved, and that lesson had to be unlearned privately. The leverage I discovered wasn't a secret or a weapon. It was self-sufficiency, made visible to myself. It was the knowledge that I no longer needed external validation to justify my boundaries. That changed everything. When Claire texted later that evening, something casual, something logistical, I responded politely, briefly, without invitation. She sensed the shift but couldn't locate it. "What's going on with you lately?" she asked a few days later. "You feel distant." I looked at the message and felt nothing urgent rise up. No need to explain, no impulse to reassure. "I'm just restructuring some things in my life," I replied. That was the truth. She didn't ask what that meant, and I didn't offer. The reveal wasn't something I shared, it was something I integrated. And once integrated, it couldn't be undone. I understood then that help would come, but not in the form I'd once begged for. It would come through autonomy, through alignment, through choosing myself without needing permission. And that choice, once made, is irreversible. Not because it hardens you, but because it clarifies you. The decision point wasn't a fork in the road, it was a narrowing. By then, there were no illusions left to preserve. I understood the dynamics clearly, saw the patterns without needing to excuse them, and recognized my own role in sustaining what no longer served me. The question wasn't what happened, it was what I would do now that I knew. There were several options available to me, and I considered each one carefully. Not emotionally, but ethically. I could confront Claire directly, lay everything out, explain how often I'd asked for help, how rarely it had arrived, how invisible I'd felt in moments when I was barely holding myself together. That path promised temporary relief, maybe even remorse. But it also relied on something I no longer wanted to depend on, her interpretation. I could continue as I was, quietly withdrawing, adjusting internally, letting the relationship fade into something distant but functional. That option required the least effort. It would protect my peace, but it would also leave things unresolved, suspended in ambiguity. Or I could make a structural decision. One that didn't require emotional consensus, one that aligned my actions with the clarity I now had. That was the irreversible option. I chose the one that didn't ask anyone else to change. The decision was simple in form, but heavy in implication. I would stop being the silent stabilizer in every system I inhabited, not just with Claire, with work, with family, with myself. That meant formalizing boundaries that had always been informal. It meant letting consequences land where they naturally would instead of intercepting them. It meant no longer cushioning others from the results of their assumptions about my availability. I didn't announce this choice. I didn't frame it as a turning point. I integrated it quietly. At work, I scheduled a meeting with my manager, not to complain, but to realign. I presented a clear overview of my responsibilities, my contributions, and my capacity. I asked for formal recognition of my role or a redistribution of tasks. It wasn't emotional, it was factual. The response was cautious but attentive. When you speak without apology, people listen differently. With Claire, the decision showed up as consistency. When she reached out in distress, I asked if she was looking for listening or problem solving. When she assumed my availability, I corrected it gently. When she tried to revert to old patterns, I didn't engage. She noticed. "You're really serious about this change, aren't you?" she said once, half joking. "Yes," I replied. No elaboration. That answer unsettled her more than any argument could have, because seriousness doesn't invite negotiation. The most difficult part of the decision wasn't holding boundaries with others, it was holding them with myself, resisting the urge to over-explain, letting go of the need to be perceived as kind, accepting that some people would misinterpret my restraint as coldness. I reminded myself often, clarity feels like cruelty to people who benefited from your confusion. The decision point marked the end of something subtle but significant. I stopped hoping the relationship would become something it had never been. I stopped waiting for recognition that might arrive too late. I stopped measuring my worth by how useful I was to others. What replaced that hope wasn't bitterness. It was alignment. And alignment doesn't shout. It moves. Quietly, decisively, without asking permission. Once the decision was made, there was nothing left to announce. This was the part people misunderstand most about change. They imagine it as visible, disruptive, emotionally loud. But real change, the kind that lasts, happens in logistics, in scheduling, in paperwork, in choices that don't require witnesses. I moved in silence because silence was finally mine. At work, the shift unfolded methodically. After the meeting with my manager, I followed up in writing, summarizing responsibilities, confirming expectations, and setting clear boundaries around scope and availability. Nothing confrontational, nothing accusatory, just structure. Projects that had once defaulted to me were reassigned. Timelines adjusted, meetings shortened. For the first time, my role had edges. Some colleagues were surprised. A few were inconvenienced. No one objected outright, because objections require leverage, and mine was already withdrawn. I also began exploring opportunities elsewhere. Not desperately, not reactively, strategically. I spoke with recruiters, updated profiles, had quiet conversations that didn't go anywhere, and a few that did. I didn't tell Claire about any of this. Not because it was secret, but because it was no longer up for discussion. At home, my routines shifted. I protected mornings. I stopped filling weekends with obligations that weren't chosen. I declined invitations that felt performative rather than nourishing. People adjusted or they didn't. The world kept moving. With Claire, the consequences of my silence began to surface in subtle ways. She reached out more often at first, as if frequency might restore access. When that didn't work, the tone shifted. "You don't really check in anymore," she said once. Not accusing, observational. "I don't," I replied. "I check in when I have the capacity." That sentence ended the conversation. Not dramatically, just definitely. She started experiencing small frictions that I used to absorb. Missed logistics, emotional overload, moments of overwhelm that no longer had a soft landing. She complained about feeling unsupported. I listened. I didn't volunteer. And that was the hardest part, letting someone experience the absence of what you used to provide without rushing to explain yourself. Not because they don't matter, but because you do. I was careful not to frame this as punishment. I never referenced the past, never said "you did this to me," never listed moments of neglect. I didn't need to. Systems reveal themselves when one component changes. And Claire was beginning to feel the shift, not as an attack, but as an imbalance. She asked once, "Are we okay?" I considered the question. "We're different," I said, "and that's okay." She didn't smile, but she nodded. Behind the scenes, my life was stabilizing in a way it never had before. Not because things were easier, but because they were mine. My energy, my time, my choices. Help was coming, but not in the form of rescue. It came through the agency, through alignment, through the quiet satisfaction of knowing that whatever happened next, I would not disappear to make it easier for someone else. Silence, when chosen, doesn't isolate you. It recenters you. And from that center, everything else begins to shift. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They appeared as small disruptions, minor inconveniences that accumulated into something heavier. And the most telling part was this: none of them looked like consequences to anyone else, only to the people who had grown used to my quiet presence. Claire was the first to feel it. Without my constant availability, her life didn't fall apart. but it became less cushioned. She had to plan ahead, ask different people, sit with discomfort instead of passing it off to me. At first, she framed this as bad timing. "I've just had a rough few weeks," she said during one of our calls. "Everything's hitting at once." I listened. I empathized. I didn't step in. There was a pause. "You're really not going to help me with this?" she asked. The question wasn't angry. It was confused. "I can't," I said calmly. "I don't have the capacity." That phrase had once been hers. Hearing it reflected back unsettled her. She started reaching out to other family members more often. And slowly, they began to notice something too. "Claire seems really stressed lately," someone said at a gathering. "She says she doesn't have much support." I didn't correct that narrative. Support hadn't vanished. It had redistributed. The difference was that now it required effort. At work, similar shifts were unfolding. Projects took longer without my invisible intervention. Decisions required more meetings. My absence created friction, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to be felt. People began asking questions. "How did you used to handle this? When did you start doing that? Why wasn't this documented before?" Each question revealed how much had been happening behind the scenes, how much labor had been unrecognized because it had been seamless. And now, without me smoothing the edges, the seams showed. I didn't gloat. I didn't highlight the gaps. I simply stayed consistent. Consistency is what turns boundaries into reality. With Claire, the emotional consequences were more personal. She began revisiting old conversations, not directly, but obliquely. "You know, I've always thought of you as the strong one," she said once. "I guess I didn't realize how much you carried." That was the closest she came to acknowledgement. I received it without celebration, because acknowledgement after the fact doesn't erase the pattern that made it necessary. Still, something in her was shifting. Not fully, not cleanly, but she was beginning to feel what it was like to be unsupported, not abandoned, but unbuffered. And that experience was uncomfortable. She asked once, quietly, "Why didn't you tell me it was that bad?" I answered honestly. "I did," I said, "just not loudly." She had no response to that. The consequences weren't punitive. They were proportional. They matched the reality of what I had been doing all along and what I had stopped doing. People often think boundaries cause damage. In truth, they reveal where damage already existed. I wasn't taking anything away that had been promised. I was returning responsibility to its rightful place. And as that redistribution settled, something else emerged. Respect. Not dramatic, not verbalized, but present. At work, my input was sought more deliberately. My time is treated as finite. My role is recognized. With Claire, the relationship shifted into something quieter, more cautious. Fewer assumptions, more awareness. It wasn't the closeness we once pretended to have, but it was real. And real, I had learned, is better than familiar. By the time the panic arrived, the structure had already changed. That's the part people misunderstand most. They think regret creates reversal. That once someone finally sees the impact of their actions, things can simply return to the way they were. But awareness doesn't rewind time. It only clarifies what's already gone. Claire's realization didn't come in a single moment. It unfolded gradually through missed connections and unmet expectations. Through the quiet understanding that I was no longer positioned as her emotional safety net, she began reaching out differently, not urgently, carefully. "Are you okay?" she asked one evening. "You just feel farther away." I considered that word, farther. Distance implies movement, and she was right. I had moved. Not away from her, but toward myself. "I'm okay," I said. "I've just changed some priorities." She tried then to fix it. That attempt was subtle at first. A check-in here, an offer there. Gestures that would have meant everything to me a year earlier. But timing matters. When care arrives only after consequences surface, it lands differently. Not as comfort, but as recognition of loss. She invited me to dinner, asked about my life, listened longer than usual. And I noticed something painful but important. She wasn't responding to my needs. She was responding to my absence. The difference mattered. She began referencing the past. "I didn't realize how much you were doing for me. I guess I just thought you didn't need support the way I did. I wish you'd told me." Those statements weren't lies, they were incomplete truths. I had told her, she had heard me, but she hadn't adjusted. And now, adjustment came too late. Not because I was holding on to resentment, but because the internal recalibration had already occurred. I no longer needed her to show up in order to feel stable. That's not a punishment, that's growth. One afternoon, she called me in tears. "I feel like I lost you," she said. "Like I don't know where I stand anymore." I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, there was a long silence. "You didn't lose me," I said finally. "You just don't have the same access anymore." The words weren't meant to wound. They were factual. Access, once unrestricted, feels like entitlement. When it's removed, it feels like rejection, even if it's simply a boundary. She asked, "Is there anything I can do to make it right?" That was the moment I knew it couldn't be fixed the way she meant. Because what she was asking for wasn't repairable. It was a restoration. And restoration would have required me to return to a version of myself that no longer existed. "I don't need anything from you," I said. "I just need things to stay as they are." That answer devastated her more than anger would have, because it removed the possibility of redemption through effort. You can't earn your way back into a role someone has outgrown. The panic showed up after that. She questioned herself, replayed memories, looked for a moment where she could have intervened sooner. But self-awareness doesn't undo impact. It only contextualizes it. And I didn't comfort her the way I once would have. Not because I didn't care, but because it wasn't my responsibility anymore. This was the cost of deferred attention. By the time she fully understood what had been lost, I was already standing somewhere else. Grounded, stable, no longer waiting to be chosen. Help had come, just not from her, and not in the way either of us expected. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't look like a confrontation at all. No raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic unveiling of past wounds, just two people sitting across from each other, finally speaking from where they actually stood. Claire asked to see me in person. She didn't frame it as urgent, she didn't push, she just said, "I think we should talk." I agreed. We met at a small cafe we used to go to years ago, back when our relationship felt easier, before roles had solidified into expectations. The familiarity of the place felt intentional, as if she were hoping the environment might soften what needed to be said. She looked tired, not in a performative way, in a real way. "I've been thinking a lot," she said after we sat down, "about us." I waited. She talked about guilt, about assumptions, about how she had leaned on the idea that I was fine because it made her life manageable. She didn't excuse it, but she didn't fully own it either. I listened without interruption. When she finished, she looked at me expectantly, as if waiting for a release, for anger, for forgiveness, for something that would let the tension dissolve. What I felt instead was calm. "I believe you," I said, "and I appreciate you saying it." Her shoulders dropped slightly. "But?" she asked. "But understanding isn't the same as repair," I continued, "and repair doesn't always mean returning to what we were." She frowned, not defensively confused. "I'm not angry with you," I said. "I'm just not available in the same way anymore." She asked, "Is that because of me?" I considered that. "It's because of what I learned about myself," I said, "about what I'm willing to give without being met." That answer didn't give her a role to play. No apology is perfect, no action item to complete. And that made her uncomfortable. She asked quietly, "Do you still want a relationship with me?" "Yes," I said, "just not one that requires me to disappear." The sentence landed heavily between us. She nodded slowly, absorbing it. There was no dramatic resolution after that. No tears, no promises, just an acknowledgement that something had changed and would not be undone. We talked about logistics, holidays, expectations, boundaries. It was the most adult conversation we'd ever had. And it was possible only because I wasn't trying to be understood anymore. I was stating reality. As we stood to leave, she said something that surprised me. "I didn't realize how much I depended on you being quiet." I met her eyes. "I didn't either," I said. That was the confrontation. No heat, no collapse, just truth, spoken without urgency. And that was enough. Who I am now isn't a reaction to what happened. That distinction matters to me. I didn't rebuild myself in opposition to my sister or my family or the roles I once played. I rebuilt myself in alignment with something quieter and more stable, the version of me that no longer needed to be invisible to be accepted. My life today looks calmer from the outside. Fewer obligations, fewer explanations, fewer emotional negotiations that go nowhere. But inside, it's fuller, more deliberate, more honest. I no longer introduce myself through usefulness. When people ask how I'm doing, I don't default to fine unless I mean it. I don't perform resilience for comfort. I let pauses exist in conversation without filling them. I let people feel uncertainty instead of rushing to smooth it over. And something interesting happens when you do that. The people who value you adapt. The people who only benefited from you don't. I'm no longer surprised by either outcome. With Claire, the relationship has settled into something quieter. We talk, we share updates, we show up for each other in ways that are defined, not assumed. There is more respect now, but also more distance. And I'm at peace with that. Closeness that requires self-erasure isn't closeness. It's proximity. I've learned to tell the difference. At work, my role has changed. Not dramatically, but meaningfully. My responsibilities are clearer. My time is treated as finite. When I speak, it carries weight because it's no longer constant. Scarcity, when chosen, creates value. But the most important change isn't external. It's internal. I trust myself now in a way I didn't before. Not to endure, but to discern. To know when silence is wisdom and when it's avoidance. To recognize when help is being offered genuinely and when it's arriving only because absence has made someone uncomfortable. I don't confuse attention with care anymore, and I don't chase repairs that require me to become smaller. The wound that once defined me, the feeling of being overlooked, unheard, quietly dismissed, doesn't dominate my identity now. It informs it. It reminds me of what happens when I abandon myself slowly, politely, in the name of harmony. I no longer do that. That doesn't make me colder. It makes it clearer. I still care deeply. I still listen. I still show up. But I show up as myself, not as a role someone assigned to me without asking. And that, more than anything else, is the quiet dominance I didn't know I was building all along. Not dominance over others. Dominance over my own presence. There's a reason I wanted to tell this story without shouting, without villains, without a clean victory moment. Because most real losses don't come from cruelty. They come from familiarity. They come from the quiet belief that someone will always be there, so consistently, so reliably, that their presence stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like a guarantee. I don't believe my sister set out to hurt me. I don't believe she woke up one day and decided my needs didn't matter. What happened between us was slower than that and more common. She trusted the version of me that never asked for much. I kept performing that version because it felt safer than asking to be seen. And somewhere in that space, a gap formed. This story isn't a warning against helping others. It's a reminder that help given without limits eventually becomes expectation, and expectation, when unmet, becomes resentment. The moral isn't cut people off. It's pay attention to what your silence is teaching them. When you stay quiet to keep the peace, you're still communicating. When you absorb discomfort so others don't have to feel it, you're still shaping the relationship. And when you finally stop, the shift can feel shocking, not because you've changed suddenly, but because you've stopped compensating. Help did come for me, but it didn't come as a rescue. It came as permission I gave myself. Permission to stop explaining, permission to stop waiting, permission to let people experience the natural consequences of their assumptions. That's not revenge. That's alignment. If there's one thing I hope stays with you, it's this. Being reliable is not the same as being valued. And being needed is not the same as being known. You don't owe anyone your invisibility. You're allowed to choose when to be available. You're allowed to outgrow roles you never agreed to. And you're allowed to let relationships change when you do. Before I end, I want to ask you something, not as a conclusion, but as an opening. Have you ever realized that the moment someone finally noticed your absence was the moment you realized how much of yourself you'd been giving away? If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.